Good evening, everybody. I'm Carla McNeil, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Riette from Bounse, who is joining me this evening for our final chit chat for 2020. Good evening, Riette.
Thank you, Carla, for having me. Good evening.
It's really, really lovely to see you again. Let's begin with perhaps you sharing a little bit about who you are, where you're based, and how you got into becoming an audiologist and specialising in auditory processing disorder.
Sure. I've been an audiologist for close to 20 years, and I'm not even sure exactly why I started doing it, to be honest, way back in the day. That's going back a few moons. But I have been based here in Hamilton for most of that time. And when I first worked at Waikato Hospital, I did sort of dabble in auditory processing evaluations and testing then, but it kind of was triggered again a few years ago when I actually had difficulties with my own son, who had sort of difficulties expressing himself. And it sparked my interest to learn more about it and become a bit more specialized in not necessarily just auditory processing, but also communication, and especially children who have difficulties with communication. So I do have a master's degree in communication pathology, so it was kind of a natural flow-on effect to become a bit more sort of specialized in that field. So Bounse kind of started around, well, it sort of started around last year sometimes, but the doors for our clinic actually only opened up in earlier this year. We're based here in Hamilton and Peach Grove Road, but we also have a satellite site in Taupo.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's very handy info. So let's jump into a little bit of a Q&A. And for those people who have joined us this evening, please at any stage pop your questions in the comment thread below, and I'll keep an eye on those, and hopefully we can have some time to come to them. So shall we just begin, Riette, with you sharing some of your knowledge and expertise to help people understand what auditory processing disorder, or APD, actually is?
Sure. So auditory processing or difficulties or disorder is basically the brain not knowing what to do with the sound that it hears. So in many cases, it's not related to a hearing loss or a hearing problem. It's more to do with what we interpret from the sound or the signal. So to break it down very simply, communication is information coming in and information being processed in the brain, and then information going out. So step 1, 2, and 3. So the information coming in is either generally visual or auditory for kids. And bearing in mind, in a classroom environment, close to 70% of the information coming at the child is auditory. So it's what they have to listen to, instructions and information, spoken information. So that's the information coming in. Now, if the hearing organ is not working well, or there's some sort of problem with the pathway, then that could affect that first step in the communication process. However, if a child has normal hearing and there's nothing wrong with the ear, then we're looking at that processing side, step 2. So in this case, there are a lot of things that can go wrong, and there's a lot of things like ADD and autism spectrum disorder and dyslexia and APD for that matter, that form these sort of very intricate webs of what we do with information in our brain and how the brain processes that information. So obviously there's a lot of things that can go wrong in that step 2. And then step 3 is obviously the information being articulated in speech, writing, reading, these kind of things, information coming out. So as you can imagine, if step 1's not working well, then step 2 and 3 will be affected. Or if step 1's fine, but step 2 is affected, then step 3 is going to be affected. So that's kind of the gist of it. So the auditory processing side of things is just literally what the brain is doing with this information that it's getting in. And most of our understanding of speech and language is actually what happens in the brain, not the ear.
Absolutely amazing explanation. Thank you. I've heard that explanation a number of times and read about it, and the way you articulated that in the 3 steps was just so succinct and really easy. I'm hoping for people to understand and follow. So if that's what auditory processing is, and I'm feeling like it's a process of elimination, you know, that the first port of call, if parents suspect that their child may have an auditory processing disorder, would be to go to number 1 and check that hearing is intact first.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I always say the first step is check the eyes and check the ears. Make sure that the information coming in, the signals coming in, is coming the right way. You know, you're getting the right signal to be able to process that signal. If those have been checked off, and you're absolutely right, Carla, it's very much a process of elimination. I kind of call it an unbundling process, where we literally sort of like unpack everything to understand exactly what it is that's going wrong. But once you've figured out that the signal going in is not the issue, then we obviously start looking at how that signal is being processed.
I think that's a really hard thing for parents, isn't it?
Yep.
It's a hard thing for parents, because it's difficult as a parent, and both of us have children who potentially, or who do have APD, so you've kind of been through those processes, but it's hard to appreciate that there are potentially a number of steps involved, and a number of evaluations and or assessments involved, until you'll really unlock what's going on and develop the depth of understanding necessary to understand your child and have empathy with them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that was kind of where the name Bounse came from, to be honest with you. It was because, in my own experience, and I'm sure you can relate, we got bounced around a lot. We went from one place to the next place, and then you got to a point where somebody said, oh, well, you're too old for us now, we have to move you on to this, you know, facility or incorporation or whatever. So for me, that was a real passion with Bounse, was to create a place where people can come, and that unbundling process can happen in the same place with the same person, so that you kind of look at that child in a holistic way. Making sure that whoever is involved or whoever I'm collaborating with, we're still looking at this child in this holistic sort of manner. And
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about how APD presents? What would be the sort of signs or characteristics of a child who's presenting with APD?
Sure. There's definitely some very key characteristics, and I'll also love to just talk about the different skills involved with processing as well. If I may, I'll start with that. So there are a number of skills involved, but there's mainly 4 groups or 4 categories. So what we do with the sound, or how we process auditory information, the first skill is discrimination. So that's the ability to tell the difference between different sounds. You know, being able to tell that it's a m and not an n, or especially, and if you think about it, if that differences in phonemes happen in an environment where there's lots of information, lots of background noise, and it's happening in a constructive sentence, it's not always that simple to be able to discriminate. So discrimination is the first one. Secondly is our ability to what we call figure to ground or signal to noise discrimination. So that's the ability to be able to listen to the signal that is important, but kind of being able to put other information or other signals in the background. And that might seem like a natural thing to some of us, but it's not for kids with APD. So we're not talking about big noisy environments necessarily, even though those would be obviously very difficult. We can even be talking about something tapping on the window or a fan going in the background. Any sort of auditory signal or sound that can be distracting means that this figure to ground discrimination doesn't work that well. That's number 2. Number 3, auditory memory. So being able to retain information while decoding it, or being able to remember multiple step instruction. Quite often I'll hear parents say, well, I, say 2 or 3 things, like go brush your teeth, then go get your bag, remember to put your shoes on, and maybe 1 out of the 3 gets done, or none of them at all gets done. Or you might ask them a question and like an hour later, suddenly you get an answer for that question. You think, where's that coming from? So all of these things are to do with that auditory memory and the time it can take to decode information. Then the last one is sequencing. So this is kind of like recalling information and putting it into context, the sort of the more temporal side, the higher functioning or higher sort of processing of the brain, remembering connections with sound. That kind of processing is the 4th element of auditory processing. So if you listen to all of this, you can understand why it's such a complicated and sort of intricate set of skills.
But just to sort of interject there, Riette, 4 things that as you were speaking, when you discussed discrimination, I wrote phonological and phonemic awareness down. When you came to signal to noise discrimination, I wrote ADD and APD.
Yeah.
When you discussed auditory memory, I wrote working memory and understanding how that interplays. So the sequencing for me was one that I didn't, but all of those other 3 areas, I think, what this highlights is the importance of experts like your field and a speech language therapist, and what we do in our education sessions must work together, like you talked about, in that holistic approach, because we are all working on very much the same cause. Would you agree with me saying that?
100%. I mean, that is literally why I guess we're having this conversation tonight, is because I really appreciate that collaboration, and you can't look at these children with your blinkers on. It's not the ideal at all, because there's such a lot of behaviors that spread over not just APD but in other aspects as well. And quite often I see children that come to me having already been diagnosed with potentially dyslexia or APD or ADD,
right,
or whatever. And it's interesting because the way I treat APD often has a positive effect on these other, disorders or difficulties as well. And it's not that I'm saying I have magic, spells that I'm sort of using, but it basically comes down to the fact it's what you've just said.
Yeah.
It all kind of is a woven web of the same kind of processing difficulties.
And it's about that understanding, isn't it? Like when you think of those things, and maybe for parents listening who do potentially have dyslexic children who present with APD, when they go back and they read their children's reports, that they can actually find those connecting pieces too. And hopefully other educators across the country and school SENCOs and learning support coordinators will be able to do the same thing to help build their knowledge of the significance of how those things work together.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important for me. Probably the most important thing is creating that awareness about APD and understanding around APD, because it forms such an integral part of that whole process of understanding what's happening.
Yeah. So we've chatted about the 4 skills. Let's now go to the characteristics of how they might present. Yes. And I'm just going to look down while you're doing this, and I'll take myself off the screen because there's a few questions flying in. So I'll just hand over to you, and then I'll come to the.
So the characteristics, things like, obviously we've talked about trouble following instructions, especially multi-step instructions. Trouble understanding what somebody's saying, and often saying things like what, or what did you say, or even having an argument with you saying you didn't say that, you said this, or you didn't ask me that, you said that, and being very sure about the fact that you said something completely different. Often being very distracted by background noise, and in some cases even being extremely sensitive to background noise or loud noises. I hear a lot of parents say they come home and they are absolutely exhausted, and the wheels come off as soon as they walk into the door. And if you think about the listening strain and having to keep it together and holding all those emotions in with all these difficulties, of course, when they get home into their safe environment, the wheels are going to come off for sure. So obviously, there's also trouble remembering information, trouble retaining information, and taking longer to respond, or in having a delay in responses. And then even things like trouble knowing where sound is coming from. We refer to it as localization. If somebody's calling them, not being sure whether it was from there or what's happening, or even making connections to sounds. So things like hearing a bird and being able to remember that it's a tui that you're hearing, and what does a tui look like? Making those connections with sound and visuals can also be something that's quite characteristic of APD.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting how for us, we hear a tui and we know exactly what that is, and we have those associations going on. Yeah, I find that fascinating, to be honest. I'm going to jump to some of the questions or statements that are in the comment thread, because there's some really interesting things there. So Sharon said that her own son has an APD diagnosis. She's seen a few articles come out saying APD is not a real condition. It's more of a language disorder, or it's actually another condition. And she just said she'd love your perspective on this.
Sure. I mean, APD, especially in the States, for example, has been around for many, many years. We're literally talking like, a good 40, 50 years. It's something that's been researched and diagnosed and treated really well. But it's always had a little bit of controversy, because I think what we've talked about before, there's such a lot of comorbidities involved. So it is quite hard to sometimes be very specific about, is this ADD? Is it APD? Is it autism? Kind of unbundling it and sort of putting everything in a category can be quite difficult. So, APD has been referred to as the auditory version of dyslexia. And it's also been referred to as a receptive language disorder. But if you think about it this way, whether it's a receptive language disorder, and if you break down what that means, receptive meaning how you, that information coming in, that's no different than what I'm saying is that the auditory processing of that information is where the problem lies. So there might be controversy around what we call it, but I think there's no controversy around the fact that there can be, and there is potentially a problem around how information is processed through the auditory pathways.
Okay, and then we've got a couple of other people who have come in and said they have been working with you. You're amazing. We already knew that though. They've spoken to you, and and you've obviously been supporting them to implement a home learning plan for their children. There's a couple of those that have come on, Riette, and said, and it's been a complete game changer. Both people that have said that it has been a complete game changer. Could you give us some examples, perhaps, of some strategies that you teach parents, or you encourage parents to implement in the home to help their children that have deficits, and particularly those 4 skills that you talked to us about earlier?
Sure. I think again, as we've said before, the most important treatment for APD is an understanding of what it is. So things like subtle things that you can do as a parent is, get their attention before you talk to them. Make sure they're looking at you. Make sure that there's as least distractions as possible. If you really want to make sure they hear you and follow what you're trying to say, maybe turn the TV down, or maybe make the iPad go away for a moment. But break things down. Keep it simple. Speak slowly, but don't overpronounce things or make it sort of like awkward for the child. Just speak slower, simplify things. And sometimes what can be really useful is just kind kind of adding a little bit of a visual to it, or adding, I often say to parents, sing it. And I know this freaks people out completely because not all of us feel comfortable doing that. But what I mean by that is maybe adding a bit of a tone or a rhythm to information that you want them to retain. So, for example, adding a bit of a tone or rhythm, especially to a number or something like that, can actually trigger different parts of the right hemisphere in the brain. That means that we're using different aspects of the brain to help with the processing of auditory information. So things like seeing it, saying it, over singing it, all these sorts of things can actually just help with that auditory processing. As I said, keeping it simple, looking at them, getting their attention first, reducing the background noise as much as possible, and just having an understanding that sometimes when they don't follow or they don't hear, it might not be that they're not listening. It is actually genuinely that they just don't know what it is that you've said.
Yeah, and I guess if it's okay for me to potentially add one more thing into it might not be that they're not listening. Further to that, it might not be that they're not trying to pay attention, or they're intentionally misbehaving. It may well be, like you say, that they are really struggling to take that information in and process it and work out what they've got to do with it and hold it, and all of those things that you explained in those 4 skills that are just completely locked in here for me now. It's so clear. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think about behavior as well. Kids, those behaviors that you can potentially see in the classroom or at home, I generally find there's 2 groups of kids. There's the ones that kind of retreat and become really quiet and almost sometimes give up a little bit on trying to figure things out. And then there's the ones that kind of take control and they become loud and try and control the environment that they're in, because that way they feel like they have control, because otherwise they don't. So there's a lot of those behaviors that might not make sense because you kind of look at it just as the behavior, but when you understand where it's coming from, a lot of it makes more sense.
The strategies that you gave us, Riette, for, when we were talking about parents and things they can take into consideration at home, would you say, because Kylie's asked, as a classroom teacher, what are the key indicators? So I'm thinking the key indicators will be much the same as those 4 skills.
Yeah.
Aspects of the 4 skills.
Yeah, I think it's kind of when I'm going to be running a few workshops for teachers and parents over the school holidays. So Kylie, they're free workshops, so please feel free if
you're great
to attend them, and I'll be going into much more detail around how teachers can identify APD in a child, what's the next step for them, and how they can modify the classroom and what they do to make it easier for them. So
how do people get to know when those workshops are coming up?
Sure. So please keep an eye on the Facebook page. We'll be posting the registration process and when we will be having these workshops, hopefully before the end of the week.
Cool. And we'll share that on our page too, but I'll go in later when we're finished and I'll pop a link to your Facebook page in our comment threads, so then people can jump onto your page and follow and see when that's coming up. Because I think that'll be really, really beneficial for an awful lot of people. Prepare to be bombarded.
So yeah, as I said, that going into sort of a little bit more, like I call it a duck dive, because we're sort of touching the surface now, and in the workshops we'll just be going a little bit deeper than the surface as to how to identify them, what to do, what's the next step, how to modify what you're doing. Yeah.
One of the things we haven't really touched on yet is assessment or evaluation. Can you just tell us a little bit about how that assessment and evaluation process works?
Sure. So obviously we did touch on the fact that we definitely need to do a hearing assessment first and foremost, but so I'll always sort of check in with the parents if that's been done, and if not, we can definitely do that as well. But the actual auditory processing evaluation is quite full on. It's a good 2 hours. And I often say to parents, allow 2 to 2.5 hours, because I give kids a few breaks in between, because it really taps them. They generally sort of go home and they're quite tired. what we focus on is a number of aspects that we're evaluating. So we're looking at things like auditory memory, we're looking at that figure to ground discrimination, what we call binaural integration. So these are all very big words, but essentially that's my job to figure it out as to what and where it is actually potentially going wrong, and getting a really good understanding of the processing process. Once that's done, I always make time after the evaluation to walk through the report with parents, because that's, again, something that I always found really hard when getting a report and it makes no sense and it doesn't really give you what you were looking for as a parent. So I call it a report handover, where I talk through it and we discuss as to what is the treatment process and what's the plan moving forward for your child, because APD is very much treatable. So the evaluation process itself, as I said, is a APD evaluation that can be done by Bounse. And as Carla and I talked about beforehand, we're just now starting a process where we can do these evaluations online as well. So it doesn't necessarily, you don't necessarily have to be in Hamilton to have it done. And there are a number of other providers around the country, not a lot, only a handful, some in Auckland, one or two in Wellington, I think, but there is an APD map if you wanted to look for somebody that can do these evaluations for you in your area or online.
Yeah, that's great. And I know that you have, or that there is quite an extensive wait list for APD evaluations. And I know of, I'm going to say, family members of mine that have flown to Hamilton to work with you, because one, of the high level of your work and how credible your services are, but also because it is so difficult to get access to that support. One of the questions, Catherine's asked a question, I don't know if you'll be able to answer this, but she has said, Catherine's an assessor herself, and sorry, correct me if I'm wrong, Catherine, but I'm thinking you're an ed psych. And so she talks about, as with so many of these complex and interrelated issues, remedial support for one aspect, for example, phonemic awareness, can provide aspects of APD. Then she goes on to say, do you have any feedback on the central auditory processing kit from Mary Ann Mokihama? I don't know if I'm saying that right. Old but good. Are you aware of that?
I'm not aware of that one specifically, no, but I do agree that there are a lot of phonemic training structures and programs out there. And I can't say that any of them are, no-go areas, or any of them are so much better. I obviously know what I use and what I feel works best. For me, the phonemes that I tend to focus on very much depends on whether I pick up patterns during the evaluation. So not every single child I approach in the same way. And I guess that's why I'm probably more of a fan of looking at the child as an individual and not following an extremely strict program. Of course, I do have programs, and I do have kits and systems that I have as part of my toolkit. But most importantly for me, it's about understanding that child, identifying patterns. I do a very extensive phoneme error analysis of each evaluation I do. And that gives me great insight as to, are we seeing a pattern? Are we seeing submissions? Are we seeing omissions? Is there specific additions to certain phonemes or blends and things like that? So I very much structure it around my evaluation.
Can you share with us some insight into who you work with, like sort of the age range of people that you work with? And then also, is there an age for having your child assessed for auditory processing disorder?
Yeah, I think generally in New Zealand, children were only being assessed from the age of 7 and up. And a lot of that has to do just with normative data and what was available. So I start assessing or am able to understand a child's auditory skills from the age of 3.5 and up. So that's kind of in an ideal environment, where we should be sort of starting to look at these things. But obviously it's not always that easy to identify it at that point in time. Quite a few of the kids I've seen recently are around that age of 5, where they might have just started school and there has been a few issues that have popped up. But yeah, essentially the bracket of children between 3.5 and 7 is able to be assessed through an auditory skills assessment, which is probably a slightly different kind of test battery. And then from the age of 7 and up, it's a much more sort of like formal or structured test battery. And we're kind of spoiled, to be honest, as audiologists, as to how many tests we have available. There's a number of them. And so again, I tend to put a bit of a package together as to how I assess the child based on the child and based on the information I gather from the parents beforehand.
That's great. Awesome. Thank you so much. My goodness, there are so many key takeaways, Riette, from what you have shared with us this evening. If you could share one more thing to, maybe it's two, sorry, if you could share one more thing, and it might be the same thing, for, what would your key message be, knowing what you know now and having seen, the difference that you're making to families and to classroom teachers by raising awareness and helping others to build their knowledge and their practice. What would be one key tip for families, perhaps, and one key tip for those who are teaching children in a classroom?
I think it would probably have to be investigate APD, even if it's not necessarily something that's at the top of the list. It's I wouldn't say it's an easy one to tick off the list, but it's definitely, probably in my opinion, a bit more easier than some other difficulties or disorders. And if it does show that there are processing difficulties, because it's something that can be treated, it can have such a significant impact. So I guess look into it as a teacher or as a parent. Look into it. Don't let it slide, and don't let it go down to the bottom of the list.
And am I right in remembering that you have a great fact sheet on your website?
I do have some resources on my website. My website is a bit of a work in progress at any given point in time, Carla. But if there's not something on the website you're looking for, then please feel free to email me or touch base in any way. I'm really happy to share resources and share information. For me,
that's great. Thank you.
The most important thing is about creating awareness and sharing the understanding of it. So again, hence that's why we're doing the workshops for free during school holidays.
That's wonderful. Wow. Hey, it's been absolutely amazing to chit chat with you this evening. Thank you so much for giving up your time to come and really help us to build our understanding of what APD actually is. I really enjoyed in particular when you talked us through the 4 key skills. I think that's a really key takeaway for people to understand. I also found it really beneficial when you talked about the importance of us taking a collaborative and a holistic approach to working with children who present with learning differences, and understanding that the way we are going to make the biggest difference is if we do collaborate with other experts and really build our knowledge and understanding of what's going on of that child. So thank you so much. This is our 17th chit chat for the year, Riette. I actually, just before I came on with you, I went and I had a little count up, and I was thinking, oh my gosh, I wonder how many of these expert chit chats we've done, and there have been 17. So that's pretty cool. So we're going out with a bang listening to you this evening. And
I'm thrilled. Thank you so much.
And for those of you who are listening in, we are kicking the year off with a bang too. So we're joined by Dr. Carol Tolman, one of the co-founders of Letters, in January. Then in February, we're joined by Dr. James Chapman, a very amazing New Zealand researcher. And then in March, we're joined by Laura Stewart from the Reading League. So we have 3 amazing chit chats coming up for you in the new year. But Riette, thank you once again so much for joining me this evening. I wish you and your family a very, very Merry Christmas.
Thank you so much, Carla, and the same to you. And thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Good night, everybody.